that I was talking to who doesn't currently attend church. And so we got to talking about why he didn't attend church. And he said, well, as a kid, one of his experiences with religion was that he went to church with his mother. And that church didn't sing any hymns. They didn't believe that singing was appropriate. They thought it was the devil's work, not a way to continue to expand the liturgy. And this, coupled with his father's Jewish tradition, which used music in all that they did, had a cantor who sang, he didn't quite understand the strangeness of the differences that were so far apart that he said religion became a very difficult concept for him. Imagine a church that does not sing hymns. What? No music? I think this congregation would revolt if they didn't have music as part of your liturgy. I've learned more hymns since I joined this church than all the rest of my adult life, because you will sing all your hymns and sing them all over again. You don't have 10 you like and that's all you sing. You really enjoy your music and the message it sends. And it is truly a critical part of liturgy. It always has been a critical part of how we worship. And for this young man, attending one church that didn't allow music and one that did, his religious experiences were very diverse, and they involved his parents, people that he trusted, which made it even more confusing to him. And I guess I could see why he didn't really know how to walk into a church and worship. He wasn't sure what he was going to find, and he just was afraid he would do the wrong thing at the wrong time. And I hope that we don't do that to folks when they come in the door, and we try not to. We try to be very welcoming, bring them in, let them get settled, help them understand what we're doing. And I think that is one of the things today that keeps so many people out of churches, that they really don't know why they come or understand why they do what they do when they get here. It's kind of challenging to wrap your mind around religion if you haven't done it for all the years of your life, if it's something relatively new. And so I guess that's why I take a little bit more teaching approach to everything we do. I try to explain it. I try to help people understand why we're doing what we do, because even for me, there's just lots of things I haven't learned. Every week as I prepare, I learn something new. Thank you for reading Psalm 30, Hunter. Here's the tidbit on Psalm 30 and where the Psalms come from. So Psalms are a little different than the rest of the Old Testament. You might have noticed they're a little bit more like poetry. And some of you might remember the reason why. They're the hymns of the Jewish tradition. So from Psalm number 1 to whatever the last psalm is, I forgot to look. That's their liturgical calendar through the year. They start at Psalm number 1 and they work their way through the Psalms over the course of their year. Hymns landing in appropriate spots to celebrate holidays. And so if you'd gone to the synagogue this weekend, you'd have heard Psalm number 30 sung. Psalm number 30 is a rejoicing hymn. It is a hymn that rejoices that the temple has been established. And they would use it every year as they came into Shabbat to celebrate the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, but also the first fruits of the 4-year-old trees and the temple that would be standing in Jerusalem. It's a one-day holiday or a 2-day holiday, depending on Shabbat is a short holiday relative to some of the other Jewish traditional holidays. And today, the synagogue would be blessed, or not today, obviously it's a Sunday, this week, Friday or Saturday, depending on the tradition, the synagogue would have been blessed with the first fruits of the summer harvest. Kind of interesting that there's a pilgrimage, an annual pilgrimage found in the Psalms. Kind of interesting to know that as we read the Psalm on Sunday, which we don't read every Sunday, or we sing the Psalter, which we do on some Sundays, that we are in sync with our Jewish roots with the Jewish church and the tradition that is happening that same weekend for them in their worship. And in the New Testament reading, we will hear the next step for Jesus. So Jesus has been teaching on his own, remember? Then he gathered up 12 disciples, and they came with him. So he's now expanded from being a sole proprietor to having a staff. Pretty cool. And today we'll hear him expand that just a little bit more. So we'll go from Jesus the CEO with the disciples as his first, second tier support, his supervisors, to now he's going to call a few more folks to come in and be his new customer support trainers or his tier 1 support. So he's going to have more outreach. He's going to have a pyramid effect, so to speak, in his organization. So we read Luke 10 today. After this, Luke appointed 72 others. No, not Luke. After this, Jesus appointed 72 others and sent them on ahead in pairs to every town and place he intended to visit. He said to them, "The harvest is rich, but the workers are few. Therefore, ask the overseer to send workers to the harvest. Be on your way, and remember, I am sending you as lambs in the midst of the wolves. Don't carry a walking stick or a knapsack. Wear no sandals and greet no one along the way. And whatever house you enter, first say, 'Peace be upon this house.' If the people live peaceably there, your peace will rest on them, and if not, it will come back to you. Stay in the house, eating and drinking what they give you, for the laborer is worth a wage. Don't keep moving from house to house. And whatever city you enter, after they welcome you, eat what they set before you. Heal those who are sick in that town, and say to them, 'The reign of God has drawn near to you.' And if the people of any town you enter don't welcome you, go into the streets and say, 'We'll shake the dust of this town from our feet as testimony, but know that the reign of God has drawn near.'" May we bless that reading to our hearts. And know that Luke was written about 20 years after Matthew and Mark. So at this point, the persecution had been reduced for Christians, or they weren't called Christians then, but for the Church of the Way, this offshoot of the Jewish tradition. They were looking for some legitimacy as a religious group. They were stepping away from their Jewish traditions, and they were reaching out to those who had also stepped away. They also were reaching out to a whole group of people who had stopped practicing the Jewish tradition. So much like the young man in the original story that I started with, who wasn't sure how to approach religion, there was the same kind of contingent at this point in time, about 90, that they didn't know how to wade into all the Jewish laws and all the rules of the Jewish tradition. And so it was important to the writer of Luke that we realize this, that we realize that the teachers of this new religion were reaching out, and they were reaching out regardless of tribe or nationality, gender, or practices. They were reaching out to everyone, and it is Luke who brings us the story of the Good Samaritan. Matthew and Mark did not share the story of the Good Samaritan. Luke does. Luke talks about the Samaritans as a group of people that were ostracized, and that we should reach out to those people, and gives it to us through this story of the Good Samaritan, where a person is robbed and beaten, a Samaritan is robbed and beaten, person is robbed and beaten, and a Samaritan stops to help. Bottom line, I'm not going to pass Sunday school today, but bottom line, reaching out to the other. Stepping across the boundaries to an untouchable, to a person who only needs care and healing, who's been left beaten and needing someone to care for them. someone who's considered unclean and unworthy of help, reaching out and providing his own resources to help. You see this throughout Luke. It is very subtle, but he leans on the Old Testament stories, but he also expands them and encourages that inclusion of everyone. He also works really hard to maintain ties with the Jewish tradition, to use it as a way of telling the story of Jesus and who Jesus is, that Jesus is the most powerful prophet to have come. He is the Messiah that the Jewish tradition expected to arrive. So he doesn't focus. Matthew and Mark focus on Jesus' teaching, Jesus' life, the disciples, the Last Supper, the crucifixion, the resurrection. As you read Luke he tells all that, but he focuses on the ascension of Jesus. Now, we talked about that last week. We talked a little bit about how the law got handed down to Moses, and then we talked about Elijah, who was the prophet that was of great import in the old tradition. And then he and his understudy, Elisha, took a journey to be his last, and he was swooped up by a flaming carriage and horses, taken to heaven, leaving behind his mantle or his sign of prophecy with Elisha. I see a few glimmers of recognition, so you remember that story from last week. And so what Luke tells us is that Jesus is the new Moses and Elijah. That Jesus is right there following the tradition of Moses, who brought the laws, and Elijah, who was the great prophet. And that is why when Luke tells the story of the ascension of Jesus going off to heaven, he goes with Moses and Elijah. It's Moses and Elijah that accompanies him. And that's different, a completely different story than what we find in Matthew and Mark. And not only that, but he doesn't get swooped off in a carriage. There are tongues of fire and a great wind that covers all. And suddenly everyone can speak everyone else's languages and understand each other. There's no selected and unselected for Luke. Luke includes everyone. That wind and those tongues of fire and the understanding of language and the ability to speak languages, that all came to everyone. All were to be treated like humans. All were to be divinely inspired creations of God. No one was to be subservient to anyone else. No one was expected to be in chains. No one was to be perceived as of less value. Luke was writing and teaching people who were very dissatisfied with the current teachings of their leading institution, the Jewish tradition. They didn't feel that those laws were working for them. They didn't feel like those services were working for them. They were not too sure about this new group of people who followed Jesus. They were not too sure whether they believed the stories that Jesus taught. They really didn't know about what to think about these 12 people that had joined Jesus. Now there were 72 more. Things were kind of okay. The Roman Empire made things fairly secure. They had food. They had jobs, sort of. They weren't really too sure about the security of all of that. But things were pretty stable. So they really didn't know if they wanted to go over here and join these others or not, or if they wanted to just kind of hang out in their own little secure place in the world, or maybe just not participate at all. And as I read that story, as I prepared, I realized they were not so unlike us. As we find ourselves in the same sort of situation in many ways in America today. people aren't so sure that religious institutions work for them. They're not really so sure about what the government's doing, but life is kind of okay, although they're kind of concerned they might lose their job tomorrow. They're kind of concerned something could happen that would make life tough. So there's a balance of fear and a balance of, well, things are kind of okay. I don't want to disrupt them by taking a risk and hanging out here and doing something new. Kind of interesting. A human condition repeated. Probably not for the first time. Probably the balance that we work on all the time. Fear of a risk versus actually stepping out, learning something new. In the pilgrimage that we're on to learn new things constantly. I came across this study, and I laid a copy of it over on the table yesterday. It is the Public Religion Research Institute and Brookings Institute's review of immigration. It's an immigration survey report, and how do we all feel as we come into this election? So, you can break it out and look at what they have to say about Republicans and Democrats and liberals and conservatives if you want to. Label-wise, I just was more interested in overall what we think about our world at the moment here in America. Right now, they said that there are high levels of concern and anxiety and fear in the American public. Fear that they might lose their job. Fear that the immigration of non-Christians might cause damage to their lives. Nearly 6 in 10 white Americans say they're not comfortable being around immigrants who speak little or no English, compared to 4 in 10 black Americans and under 1/4 of Hispanic Americans. Fewer than 4 in 10 Americans say the current immigration system in the United States is generally working. Few Americans know that the deportation rate of illegal immigrants has increased in recent years. Only 25% of Americans believe the number of illegal immigrants being deported over the past 5 or 6 years has increased. It has increased. Nearly 6 in 10 Americans oppose building a wall along the border. And a majority of Americans oppose passing a law that would deny Syrian refugees entrance to the U.S. Nearly 6 in 10 Americans oppose placing a temporary ban on Muslims. So, kind of, we're on both sides of the coin on this one. Change is just difficult. Change was difficult in 70 when Luke was written. Change is difficult in 2016 in which we live. People are fearful of what they do not understand and cannot explain, whether it's 70 or 2016. Teachers and prophets are needed to bring the balancing messages just as Jesus, the 12, and the 72 did, whether it's 70 or 2016. We still struggle to manage all the information we receive, but I know that as we start our pilgrimage and continue our pilgrimage today, we'll continue to learn about being a community of love, about being a community of inclusion. We'll continue to deliver that message in all that we do. We'll learn about being a community of equals and a community of optimism, and we'll give up the fears and the walk in faith. We will walk in faith. We'll reach out to the other and embrace the differences. We'll reach out to the hurting and lift them up. We'll encourage people to stop the hate rhetoric that we hear. We'll do our research. When we meet people, we'll talk to them, we'll share, and we'll learn from each other. We won't blindly follow the opinions of others. America, wasn't really founded as a Christian country. It was founded as a country of freedom. While some came seeking religious freedom, others came seeking freedom from bondage. Others came seeking freedom from poverty. Others came seeking freedom from war. Not too much has changed. That's why people still come to America today, to embrace the capabilities of these communities that they can live in here, to continue to be great, to continue to be inclusive, to continue to help the Samaritans, to continue to look for the other who is lost and beaten, to provide health and productivity and jobs. God brought us together for a reason. And since we believe that our God taught love, then if our God taught love, taught us that each and every life counts, taught us that separation isn't appropriate, taught us that we are just one tribe, God's tribe, then we need to go forth as prophets of that message and help bring the tribe back together. Amen. Hymn number 11 in the New Century Hymnal, Bring Men.